Greetings to our usual participants. I see Eduardo, I see Ray, Rich. Yogesh is just joining. Let's wait a few minutes for folks to join.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, John. I was just saying that we should give folks a few minutes to join, then we get started. Hey, Steve.
And did we finalize the agenda for today?
Yeah. We will do an agenda bashing in a second, and then hopefully we will make some progress on the registration policy topic. But if there's some other topics you guys want to talk about, happy to consider those during the agenda bashing as well. Is that good for you?
Sounds good.
Good. Are you here for the full hour today?
I believe I am, actually.
Okay. I will take some notes again, as always, but if someone can help me, that would be fantastic as well. Okay, I guess, John, it's time to get started, right? So, you would say so?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Welcome to our sort of weekly virtual interim meeting for the SCITT working group. We've sent around, well, last week's discussion, we concluded that we wanted to talk about the registration policies at this meeting. In case you have some other topics, it would be good to bring them up now so we can do a little bit of agenda fine-tuning. Is there anything else? Don't hear anything. Or Ray, do you have something?
I was just gonna say I actually have been working on this stuff in terms of the endorsement, and then I did get my submission in, so I guess I'll send that submission thing to the list in case people are interested. That was a submission to the Election Assistance Commission for their thing, but it includes the protocol, and I'm looking at the well, I don't need to give a full, let me just finish this, that the the air gap, protocol, in trying to blend that with TLS. But that's what I'm working on. It's really not ready for discussion yet. Thanks.
Okay. But is that related to the action item you had when we talked about the transparent statement URLs? And
Yeah.
you brought up the air gap scenario. Is that in that
right.
context?
If we have time after the main body, I can go into my current thoughts on it.
Okay, yeah, please post it also on the list so I can reference it in the meeting minutes.
Yeah, okay, good. I'll put, because I did work pretty hard on this submission for, and I'm hoping to get a cryptography group started on this elections with NIST, because they've shut everything down prior to about 2 years ago. But
okay.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's actually quite a relevant topic for someone living in Austria, because some of our politicians messed up the most recent elections. They made an Excel sheet error, as it turned out, and switched the candidates as by doing so. So yeah, so maybe actually quite useful.
Oh yeah, it's a hot topic.
Okay, cool. Good. John, you are in the queue. Is that intentional?
It is, just because I took an action a couple of weeks ago on the last time's hackathon stuff. Just as a progress update, since we have time on the agenda bashing. I'll edit that doc in a minute to put some links in. So there is a branch in the public SCITT community working group GitHub for my implementation of the end-to-end receipts process, which people are free to look at and discuss. I just need to update some of the docs before I turn it into a real PR, but there is a usable implementation, and the Microsoft provided emulator are both up there and working if people are interested.
Okay, yeah, that's a good topic, because a few weeks ago we made a call basically to everyone showing interest in the hackathon preparation, and so that would be quite timely. So let me put it on the meeting notes, onto the agenda. So we have the hackathon and the voting topic. I will reframe it. Okay, so we have those, and we also have the registration policy. So 3 topics. Okay, perfect. So we'll cover those. Anything else? I see Neil, you joined as well. Excellent. Charlie, also here. Good. Peter. Okay. So regarding the registration policy, so I looked at the open issues. Let's start with this one, because that was what we indicated in the official meeting invite. There are a few open issues in the GitHub issue tracker, and I will post the links to the meeting minutes, so you can click on those. They don't contain an awful lot of content, but we talked about the registration policy in the past, and the architecture draft also contains a little bit of content, contains a few attributes of that policy, but it's otherwise like everything is a little bit on the sort of not super verbose side. So the question is, like, for me, obviously we want to make some progress on this topic. This is one of the bigger open issues in the architecture document. The question is, are we a little bit too ambitious here for an initial version? Do we have something like a minimal version that we can get away with, and then extend it later on? Or where are we with this topic? Like, what's the sort of like the workable version that we could put together without going a little bit overboard with these policies? It can get very complicated at some point in time. Hank, do you have an opinion about this? Put you on the spot here.
And I can talk. Hi, how to expedite this? We need a functioning middle ground in specification 4. Issuer messages, which are sign statements, and transparent services output, which is transparent statement. That is correct. Registration policy is super complex. At the very least, I think the gatewaying function that limits issuers to transparency service, I think, should be there. Should be understood how that works, and then we are good. We're not adding anything. It's like a trust anchor store, I assume. So which gatekeeps a limited number of issuers to the service, I think. And if that would be a low-hanging enough low-hanging fruit, then we can iterate on that. This is me speaking without anyone having a stake in the implementation next to John here. So I would now sneakily put that spotlight back to John and ask him, would you see this the same way? That we could have registration policies that are basically trust anchor stores on transparency services? And I'm, again, maybe naively super simplifying this.
Trust anchor obviously means different things to different people, but following those lines, I think, is reasonable. Yeah, there's a strategic reason why we chose registration policies for the 117 focus. Is precisely because we've got these various tentacles that are very complex. So there are 39 instances of the phrase registration policies across the document so far, and the vast majority of them are using registration policies simply to gatekeep the registration of a signed statement, as you said. And the easiest way to do that is to have, as long as by trust anchor you mean it could be an IDP certificate for OIDC, or it could be some kind of more direct device certificate if we've got machined use cases with TLS, whatever it might be. I think we need to be flexible in how those work, but fundamentally some set of identity relationships for the purposes of restricting who can make a thing. Yes, I think that's the best minimum. There have been two big topics coming off this that I, as an implementer, actually have no particular stake in, but I find them unnecessarily complex for getting a version of the spec out. One is going down the road of formally specifying identities. That's how we got into all the did web and did URN stuff before. If people feel strongly that we need it, I'm happy to go down that road, but actually I think it's unnecessary for the architectural description of what a registration policy does. And more worryingly, at 116, we had a bunch of conversations about how registration policies might be much more complex than gatekeeping the requester, and actually include all sorts of other contextual ABAC style stuff. Even I don't even know what my ideas, so I can't represent them faithfully, but there were ideas of registration policies having some semantic understanding of the payload itself. And I wanted to make sure we get that all very clean and clear in what the needs of the group are, because I think that's making it more complex than what you said, I think is unnecessary and difficult, but I have heard the group express interest in it, so I wanted to flush it out.
Hank, do you want to go next? You're in the queue.
John, what group was that?
As in the group that is interested. So I've heard this was from discussions with sensible and venerable members of this group. So I think if I heard him correctly, Roy was interested in things like that, although I can't find him now on the group. I wouldn't want to misrepresent him, but I think Roy is interested in more powerful registration policies. Cedric as well did quite a bit of work around the spec at 116 hackathon to try and deal with things like that. And then Ori, who actually is here, okay, so Ori might remember better, Ori and at least both of those people, I think some others, were looking at the implications of remembering and reporting the registration policy that was in place at the time that a statement was made, which is a kind of middle ground. I actually quite like that idea, but again, it's more complex than absolutely strictly necessary. So those are all the edges to that. Really, my motivation is just to get the spec published in a version that makes sense, where we know what a registration policy does and doesn't do, and hence it being the agenda item for here.
Okay, cool. I just managed to get to the top of the queue. Thank you, Hank. I want to briefly explain what I understand when I hear trust anchors. So when a statement is signed and provided to the transparency service, that signature needs to be verified, and that happens via in directly or indirectly using some public key or /certificate, and that's the trust anchor that needs to be present at the transparency service. So does that match roughly your understanding, John?
Roughly, yes, but we have to also remember that there are newer sort of web first authentication schemes like the various OIDC flows that aren't necessarily a certificate in the way that we would think of them, but essentially,
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't need to be an X509 certificate, but conceptually, it's, for example, if that's some other structure with a different encoding, but it still reassembles the concept of a certificate, or it could be just a naked key, like a raw public key, for example.
You get,
Yeah.
so sorry, Hannes. Let me understand you're saying here. You're wanting to know the trust anchors we're talking about here, the configuration of what the SCITT ledger validates the identity against a policy for, and then signs, not the signature of the SCITT ledger itself, right?
Now, I was primarily sort of like, there needs to be some information, like in, let's use the DLS as an example, so to have fewer options. Like in DLS, if you get a certificate from the server, you need to have a trust anchor store with one or more trust anchors that allow you to do the path validation to verify the signature of what you received through the protocol. And you need something similar, something kind of equivalent in this context as well, just specifically since we have the signed statement coming to the ledgers / transparency service, and so that needs to be verified, and that's when I hear trust anchor, I think that's what I'm
which is why
that's what I understand.
Call it trust anchor, because it gets a little bit more complicated. If we're using DID web, then you still have the TLS trust anchors that you have to worry about, and then it's by proxy. So I think Ori probably gives a better definition than anybody else that I've heard.
Well, the difficulty is, John was sort of previously saying that he wants to sort of like push away the details, and he called it more complex or more challenging topics, like formally specifying the identities. But unfortunately, you somehow have to talk about those as well, because there are subtle details on how, let's say, did web, did key, etc. works with relationship to these trust anchors. They all have something equivalent, because otherwise it won't work, but it's just different terms, different everything. But I stop now and let Ori talk.
To kind of recap some of what was discussed at 116, John mentioned, several things that we talked about, and they are kind of complicated details. But I think the primary complicated one that maybe it's possible to remove from the discussion is the dependencies between different envelope formats as related to a registration policy. So, for example, if you're storing your policies in the transparency service and you want to basically reflect the policies that were in place at the time at which a signed statement was made into a transparent statement, you can do that by including identifiers in the transparent statement that we return. And as you do that, you start to build this sort of like these graphs of like, well, this thing required these, and these are the policies that were in place at this time. And that can get complicated. And it can also be allowed without us specifying it, as long as we, sort of describe that, these are the extension points that you can make use of. You can make use of the protected header. You can make use of the unprotected header. And, what you do with those values is kind of your business, but it's not necessarily ours. The issue is that if you want a consistent way to refer to a signed statement that's been made transparent in a particular service, you will have to sort of describe some identifier scheme for that. It could be a URL, it could be URN, it could be URI. But if you want to be able to take a reference from one place and make a pointer to that, in another place, you're going to be including that reference, and that's what created the complexity. So that's just a summary of kind of what was discussed. And yeah, I think the important part here is like you have signatures, you have issuers. Those are the entities that are doing the signing. You need to discover keys that are authoritative for those issuers. Every verifier relying party may have their own way of doing that, but you won't be able to discuss verifying without discussing issuer identity in some format. That's it.
Ori, follow-up question. Do you think it's possible to remove that complexity about the information of what policy was used when the transparent state or transparent statement
I think
was produced?
It was, to my understanding, it was out of scope originally to discuss policy-specific details. So right. I think including a reference to a policy by including a URI or URL is something that you can always do, but there shouldn't be any interoperability impact from the decisions that we make on that. Now, if we say, actually, there are these specific header properties that are supposed to be used to establish interoperability around references, then it's in scope. So I don't know, which of those two things we want to do, but we discussed specific header parameters that could be used to point to other references at 116. And if we wanted to go down that path, that's where we would have to continue the work.
Thanks. Yogesh.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah. Okay. So I think should we just kind of because a bit of a registration policy detail could be a very much an implementation kind of a aspect of a transparency service. Can we keep it at a high level where we say that the minimum guidelines or minimum registration policy requirements we should state in the architecture and leave it to there, because otherwise we're going in a circle where there is very much tied to an implementation which could lead to an endless kind of circles there. That's my feel, or that's my view on this.
What into the document? Would you sort of postpone it entirely to sort of an extension or a future version 2 kind of thing? or was something else?
Or something like the registration policy is required to validate the issuers with a certain uniquely able to identify the issuers unambiguously and can be recognized using some known trust anchors or something like that. At a high level, what the registration policy should do rather than how it should do
Okay.
would kind of ease out our responsibility in a way that we don't force a specific way of doing registration policy, because policy is very kind of complicated matter, and if we lock down ourselves to a very rigid policy, then also it reduces the scope of our architecture, I think. So that's all I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you, Rich. Ray.
Yeah, I agree with that concept of not, detailing it too much, but I wanted to provide what I think is a pretty powerful idea that was helping me with regard to the air gap thing, but I think it can be applied here. And that is this idea that the SCITT transparency service, the registry, everything, just the core of it though, is acting like a proxy, like a proxy agent to what would be the other side, or what would be one side of a TLS connection. So the TLS connection is already well defined and understood. Certainly we'll be using that with people communicating with the service, but I'm talking about if they say, if you would have communicated with me back at this time, I would have provided you these things to prove my identity and so forth, as a certificate that I would have provided to the other side of a TLS connection. And the SCITT service basically acts as an agent to record and memorialize those things, such that you can come back later and say, okay, well, I want to act like I'm at the other side of this TLS connection. And by kind of looking at it this way, maybe this would allow us to maybe even leverage any of the newer concepts that would be coming down for TLS, although I'm a little bit cautious about that because they don't all necessarily apply. But anyway, that is the concept that we look at. Okay, well, if we did have to act as an agent and record these things, such that in the future someone can come back and act like they're there on that side, then that may be enough. Now, if you want to establish registration policies I think that's up at a higher level, like an application layer or something, where this is more, if you will, a single-ended transport layer with this agent on one side that could act like anybody coming in later and accessing the artifacts. Just that idea, maybe that'll be helpful to think about this. And it was helping me with the air gap thing, because what I came to was that it's going to be really useful just to use TLS in some form for both sides of that, and that's going to be another good, powerful idea that can help.
Okay, thanks, Ray. Roy.
So I just wanted to voice the opinion here that we're at the point where we're trying to future-proof and think of some of the things we're going to run into going forward. I don't think there's a problem with what we have today, but we're looking for gaps or features that we think we're just overlooking. In the case of configuration of what identity providers we're going to accept, in the next 5 years, we're going to have everything from post-quantum to DID mechanisms coming in that we have to be able to adapt here. In this venue of software supply chain, we're already talking about probably trees of data to evaluate what the current security posture is based on CVEs and VEXs and SBOMs and things like this. dealing with those receipts at bulk and knowing that the configuration or the identity trust has changed since the last time we audited is why I was driving to say, hey, we kind of needed some escape hatched here to understand what the configuration is. There was other thoughts that Hank and others proposed of, hey, there's a feed, but not everybody's going to be sitting and monitoring the feed 24/7. So this is a way to deal with stored or air gapped or things carried across boundaries. Both Yogesh and Ray are correct that we could get by with an initial state. The question is, do we want to think about it now? Because pretty soon we're going to have to do something if we start getting clouds federations.
Roy, what type of information needs to be available to sort of have the policies you have in mind?
That's fair. I think from a product that's built with the SCITT building blocks, there's a different set of policy outside of this, right? So you could envision only people that are approved to be able to publish to a products cluster makes sense, but that's more of an RBAC problem that doesn't belong in the notary ledger half of this thing. What really is in the ledger portion of it is what identity providers and what sources are we going to evaluate and store the information for, because you kind of need to know that it passed some policy bar and what that policy bar is before you accept the receipt. The receipt isn't a, hey, you can go back to the ledger and go and retrieve all the raw information and rebuild the certificate chain or DID document yourself. It's more of a case of, hey, it exists. Anything that we have a receipt for must have passed a policy. The question becomes, what was the policy? But basically what you're calling trusted roots.
Okay. Thanks, Roy.
And I'm fine if you say, hey, we want to push this down the road. I suspect, though, we'll be back at this point in a year having to put in this functionality anyway.
Okay. Hank.
Yeah, this is me just being an interim summarizer. So what I choose to have heard is that I think pretty much everybody agrees that a key list of public keys somehow is required to validate issue identities. If you don't have the key, that's the gateway gatekeeper not in. So let's call this list of public keys wherever you get them from. If it's a certification path, this is basically the term that you use instead of certification path. No, sorry, certificate chain today. And so it doesn't matter where it comes from, although where it comes from will influence the second item here. So if that is an agreed one, the next step we have to agree on how is that represented? How do we represent that list of public keys that are coming from things? For example, PKX certification paths. Then, if you know how to represent it, then you have to understand where to find it. That, of course, relates to where it's stored. We have this append-only log. You can store things in there. I heard that feed might not be the only thing because you have to monitor that and or have an understanding of at least when last you monitored it. That's your current understanding of what the registration policy probably looks like. And if you know where it's stored, how to point at it from a receipt. That is basically the representation, the identifier also, if you are just not needing that. So I think these 4 items we have to agree on somehow in sequence, maybe in parallel, I don't know. And then we can progress everything. Because then you have a baseline registration policy, know where to find it, know how to deal with it, and how to establish trust into it or not. And I think that's how I would summarize it. Maybe that's again a little bit oversimplified, but we have to move, and that would be something at least I understand.
Hank, you said 4 items.
Wasn't it 4? We have to agree. First agreement is pub key list, whatever source the pub key use. again, PKI certification path might be one of them. Second item is how to represent that list as the trust anchor store.
Wait a second. There's so much noise on the line. Neil, are you? Test, Neil. Are you? Perfect. Okay. Repeat that again, Hank.
Okay, so first decision, pub key list with all the where it comes from. Yes, no. So if yes, then what's the representation of the trust anchor store thing, this bundle, or that keeps you validating issuers? Then where to store it, which basically also indicates where to find it, and then how to find it. So what's the representation of the identifier here, the lookup or resolve, whatever. And so we had for the where to store it, I heard some concerns that feed might not be good enough, and that is something we have to discuss then. But I think these 4 decision points we have to pass, and then from there we can write text pretty fast and do all the minimal required things here, and then we can progress. I think that's my naive point of view. Maybe there's some caveats there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Hank. I think I captured it. Neil.
Hi, thanks a bunch. And sorry for the audio problem. So I confess to not being really up to speed here, but I just want to briefly note that I'm kind of nervous about some of the discussion of adding more complexity to SCITT. You know, my general advice is to really simplify, really try to recognize that relying parties are really going to be the ones that have to make decisions, and just trying to provide them with you know, the set of signed statements to work with. And in, you know, so I see SigStore still as a great example. I think it is making very simple decisions about a lot of these things, and I think that people are going to have to deal with the relying parties are going to have to deal with these things. So I'm trying to picture a registration policy that would actually help relying parties, and I wonder if even the notion of restricting statements to certain issuers is going to do enough. In other words, you know, this notion of a trust anchors in a list of keys kind of way, because I think we all know that over time any given issuer might be compromised. So a relying party can't just trust all the statements that make it into a particular instance, because going back perhaps some arbitrary amount of time, you might say, wow, that issuer was actually compromised and you can't trust it. So relying parties still already have to deal with that. So, you know, from a volume standpoint, it can help to reduce the number of people that are actually publishing in a given instance, but not necessarily from a trust standpoint. And I think I saw a brief mention of TUF, the transparency. What does it stand for?
What was the abbreviation?
The TUF, the update framework.
Upward, yeah, the Upward framework provides some great ways to deal with compromise and key rotation and so on. And I think that incorporating that into the inner works of things is going to be, in a sense, more helpful than trying to add even lots of issuing party registration agreements. So I don't know, just some random thoughts, but the more complexity and the more optional stuff and the more opaque stuff, the less possible it's going to be for people to make trustworthy decisions, you know, to make actually valid decisions. Thanks.
Neil, till the point you mentioned TUF, I thought that you are arguing for not describing any policy, basically leaving everything kind of open. But then you mentioned TUF, and I happen to have looked at it in context of firmware updates, and it's actually a super complicated system. so those two things didn't quite line up with what you said.
Well, I mean, so what I'm saying is that as a relying party, I would want to understand things like tough, and I would be happy working with people who sign statements using keys that they, assert are using tough. But that's in a, that isn't trying to make. I don't know. They have thought through a very. You're right in the sense that they have thought through a very carefully designed set of policies for delegation and for key rollover and ultimate trust and so on. So in that sense, I'm endorsing them as having solved one of the very little problems. And I think just reusing it would be a fine thing, but that doesn't have to be required by SCITT. I think SCITT could basically say, a lot of people are having good luck promising that they're using tough and letting relying parties know that they should expect that. And I guess you could call that a registration policy. Again, I'm not up to speed, so I think it's a good way to frame it. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil.
One fundamental question I have is on the registration policy is, so long as we can identify the issuer, the statement is signed by the issuer identity, that key which signs the statement may not be the same key which it registers with the transparency service. Or I mean to say is that why it needs to be tightly locked, I'm not clear. Because an issuer can issue 5 different products with 5 different keys, but when it registers with the transparency service and tells that, hey, I'm an authorized issuer, it may have a different out of band identity so that the transparency service identifies that guy. So why there should be a strict correlation between signing statements versus identifying that issuer only through that means?
I didn't quite get that, your guess. Can you rephrase that?
Yeah, so basically what I'm trying to say is that an entity X registers initially with a transparency service to say that, hey, I'm entity X, and it has an identity which is corresponding to entity X, but it is using it has 5 products, and it signs these 5 products with a different identity, but it produces an identity X as part of the transaction when it is registering with the transparency service. So the transparency service identifies that this is a guy X who is issuing these statements. Why the signature on the statement should be linked to that verification in the registration policy? That is not clear to me.
So can I summarize? You're basically saying, hey, if they have an authenticated connection, they use the identity of the authenticated connection can be different than the signature on the statements they made.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
in our discussions, we don't even talk about the authenticated connection portion of this. What really matters is the signature on the statements themselves. Those are the things we're validating. Whether it comes over a pipeline that comes from a factory, let's say AWS or Google has a build service, they're just a way to get into the system. They're not making any claims of the product or whatever. It's the statement's identity that we're talking about here, and it has nothing to do with the authenticated connection.
But the registration is all about identifying who the right person is, right?
Correct, but it's based on the identity. It's similar to, you can have your wife go and take in your signed contract with a notary on it from Ontario. As long as it's Ontario notary that's understood, the fact that your wife brought it in doesn't matter. It doesn't change the statement that the notary backs your signature. Right? The transport mechanism, how it got to the notary, is not as important as the actual contract and the notarization stamp.
Okay, but if I know the guy through some pre-exchanged information, and
Correct. But But if it
Yeah.
goes in front of a judge, it's not the fact that your wife carried the document in, it's the fact that the notary saw you sign the contract. And
Okay.
your wife is out of the picture at that point.
Okay, maybe I will think about this. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, but this may be a really good example of a registration policy, because the notary, like a real notary, has to witness the actual signature of the person signing it. And they have to sit there in real time and verify the ID and so forth of that person. So the idea that, I don't think they allow the wife to bring in a signed document that they don't witness. That's a policy of what you would be the, a rule.
I just have one. Sorry, I just have one comment to Yogesh's point. I totally agree with that. We're really spending a lot of time on notaries and receipts and that sort of stuff. But if I know the party, if I'm Hitachi and I'm contracting with Mitsubishi for part, we have a long-standing relationship. I don't need a bunch of verification on that. My concern is mostly that we can track Mitsubishi's performance on delivery and all that stuff. And so I really would caution us about getting too far down the road with the various metaphors of notaries in the real world and so forth. The important thing here is the payload, not so much the various pieces of administration around it, which in my opinion are optional additional things that help the functionality, not vice versa.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, the point there is that you can, and what I actually wanted to bring up was how Let's Encrypt used. What they did was they looked for actual evidence on the domain to prove that the domain was operated by the entity that was claiming to own that domain. So that if you're a big entity like Hitachi and the rest of these big companies, then certainly you're going to have already a certificate that's formal certificate, and there's no problem 509 certificate. But within the software, like open source software world, you don't have these necessarily established entities. You may have people submitting it, and the idea would be that you could maybe leverage the concept of how Let's Encrypt does it, where what you're doing is you're having the SCITT machine just witness, okay, look, I went back and this guy proved that he has this private key that is associated with the public key at this time. And so then the SCITT machine is witnessing that. That may be, so it may be the policy though, Charlie, that you say, well, look, I need a wet signature on things, or I don't. Like I'm okay with just getting a claim that they have this private key, or that they have the artifact. So the artifact issue is another one where if somebody walks in and says, here's a hash value, and I have this artifact on my side, I'm not going to actually let you see it, but I claim to have it. Well, you have to substantiate that claim by giving it maybe a random number and say, well, now hash it with this random number the same way HMAT does. And then you do it 2 times, so you give avoidance and so forth. So then you get a value back. And anyone else who gets that can do the same. Here's that random number, and I can validate that when the guy does have it, even though we didn't actually exchange it or actually ever see it. Bringing this back around, the registration policy, I think the question in my mind is it just a matter of how well we check the certificates and so forth? Like Charlie says, well, we already know these entities, we don't have to check too much as long as they're in our list. Or we have to have wet signatures? Or is it more than that on saying it has to be a SPDX SBOM submission before I accept it and so forth? That's getting kind of too far in the weeds, I would think. But that I think is a question that's good to talk about. Thanks.
Ray, I lost you, but specifically, we talked about policies that related to the content of what is being registered, but at that point we said we are not going to do that. So in that sense,
No, I'm not saying
such a complicated
I'm just
policy.
trying to bring these questions up because I don't know what the
Eduardo.
scope is. Go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I just wanted to bring a point. Like, I understand Neil of keeping like it simple, but I also see a lot of use cases where, like, maybe, for example, in IoT or stuff, we don't have the power to, for example, verify the same policy with the same construct or like the same level of security. So as like was mentioning also, like Ray, for example, if we want to, I don't know, to verify that the private key is kept secret inside the, like it's completely secret and stuff, we might go further in the check of policies. But at runtime, we may just need to verify that it was not later on invalidated or removed as a public key. So I feel like still having the policies there is something can fasten up once we are runtime without removing trust or without moving security, I would say. So I feel like I'm not saying that it should be inside every envelope or stuff like this. It might also be, as someone suggested, directly inside the ledger that we can query and check which policy were applied or how were the policies. But I feel that removing them, let's say, as a notional, as like, yeah, removing them completely would remove some use cases where we might don't want to reproduce the whole policy, but maybe just check the validity of the key itself still. So no remove their stuff. But yeah, that's just it.
Thanks, Eduardo. Yeah, I don't think the idea is to remove like the policy functionality altogether, but I think it's just a question of what is covered at what stage. Like, is it something that is implementation specific versus standardized? And how far do you need to go with standardization at the beginning when it comes to sort of the initial version of the protocol? I think that's where I'm trying to make a judgment of what the group wants.
Yeah. No, sorry, maybe I didn't express it well, but yeah, the point was, I feel we need to standardize still what we applied, let's say it, so that I can avoid reapplying completely, but maybe checking a just a subsection of the policies or these kind of things. So I feel I would need completely the information about what was done, in my opinion, so that I don't have to replicate it completely, but I can just check some minor points, let's say.
I wonder how this would work, but maybe you can sort of explain on the list on how you think this could actually be done, like technically.
Yeah, I can think about something how to explain it. Yeah.
Charlie.
Can you hear me? Sounds good. Yeah, I think I see my little bars rising here. So the basically the use cases we've been talking about are parties that don't know each other and parties that have no exchange of hard goods for the most part. We're talking about, I think, the major use case that a lot of people are having in their minds here. Maybe it's unstated, but it's web commerce or web authentication and things like that. I have a totally different use case, and I'm just not hearing that much attention to it. And that is, I have a device, say a medical device or something that has hardware and software in it, and I have to be sure that I know the suppliers and that there's a way to track their performance and a way to understand their ownership and so on and so forth. and I'm going to be basically maintaining that, or some authoritative third party that's part of that supply chain will be maintaining that. And honestly, there's all this talk of receipts and policies and things like that are kind of side effects to that use case. And I think if you're talking about a strictly software use case, you're in a similar situation, because identification and receipting and a whole bunch of those things are just they're all self-attested right now, and that is more or less okay to start. So I would advocate spending less time, as I said earlier, on the superstructure and more time on the payload and how that could be stored and manipulated in volume. Over. Thank you.
You said you would like to spend more time on the payload?
Yes. What's the data structure that we're going to use to store an SBOM, for example? How does that relate to how do I store characteristics of suppliers and their ownership and countries of origin and other areas of concern, named individuals, all those things that I'm going to have to be worried about when the regulators come knocking, right? So, so those are important. And I also want to be able to track my own quality. So I need to track the quality of suppliers, and there's got to be a way that I can store that and evaluate it in real time for the most part, or periodically. And those topics just haven't gotten any attention at all. So I'm concerned that we're over specializing here.
Okay. Thanks, Charlie. We have 4 minutes left, and 2 people in the queue. We will definitely, John and I will definitely have to post something, the next steps on the mailing list. We had a couple of good things brought up already, so we will sort of come up with an idea on how to move forward with this. But Ray and Roy, you guys still have the floor.
Yeah, I know that certainly the payload, like the application specific payload, like shooting out from what Charlie said, is something that maybe is better. I don't know, maybe it's better done in something like a schema.org type thing, where you're working on the exact schema of the content for that use case. But I just wanted to give you this quick idea, which is to maybe use what RATS did and say, okay, we're going to have a registration policy verifier up front here, and then we can basically provide the mechanism for people for something to sort of review things before it goes into the SCITT machine, and yet not have to have us detail out exactly how it's done, above and beyond exactly what we need to maintain the basic certificates and so forth for who's putting it in and how we verified that. And I think that's the basic the basic core registration I think we're already handling. But above that, I think that may be a good way out, is to just say this is somehow put that, defer that how RATS did. They said there's a verifier that does a registration verification. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe we just should put a bullet in it and say we're done with that. Let's move on.
I just want to point out that the definition of SBOMs and VEX and CVEs are being done in the discussion with CISA and OpenSSF and a whole bunch of other committees. The relationship of those documents and the format of those documents is being defined outside the IETF. And that's perfectly understandably acceptable from where we're sitting, because there's just so much movement between various governments at this point. The conversation of RATS and how it does things and validate the relationships up front, I have no problem with. The problem here is, how do you detect when something's changed in a CCF, Confidential Compute Foundation sort of scenario with RATS? If the hardware changes, then the next layer is not going to run. How do you detect? In this case, is exactly the same thing, that configuration or a new identity provider has been changed since the last time you did your audit. And that kind of gets into some of this IoT discussion, which is why I suspect it might be worthwhile for Ray and Charlie and I to have a side conversation to make sure we're all understanding everybody's viewpoint. Because I think some of the details are getting lost here.
No, if you can detail that out, Roy, I'd love to look at the exact thing that you're thinking about. And then, because I don't really understand exactly what you mean, but if you can maybe write that up, then I'd like to understand it. Thanks.
Yeah, I too, I'm happy to participate in that, Roy and Ray. I just think, we've defined that. I mean, I'm involved in SBOM and VEX and CSAF and all kinds of other crap here. So I'm very familiar with all that. But we haven't spent any time on how we would, provide a utility to use those, which I think is the essence of SCITT. So that's where I'd like to spend a little more time, if possible. So let's talk offline.
Yep. Okay. Let's do that, guys. Thanks, Hannes. Thanks, Joe.
Roy, please copy me as well, because I feel.
Well, let's discuss it on the mailing list. I think that would be a good
discussion. That's what I meant. Yeah, the SCITT mailing list.
I could imagine that lots of people are interested in that debate.
I suspect what's going to happen here is Charlie and Ray and I are going to start a thread, make sure we have each other's thoughts and ideas captured correctly. Then we'll share it back on the alias. Right now, I think we're missing some details and talking at cross purposes. So I'd rather have an author, three of us submit something into the mailing list, but let's get it clear first.
Yeah, I'll put you on give an action item in the meeting minutes.
Awesome, Hannes. I'm feeling much better now that pneumonia is over.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Let's get this concluded.